1952, Condor County, Alabama. The pine trees stood like thin, dark witnesses along the red clay roads, and the nights belonged to men in hoods. For years, every black family in the town of Millston learned to read the sky not for rain, but for fire. Crosses burned on hilltops like warnings written in flame, and the sheriff's silence was as loud as any shotgun. In that world, fear did not float in the air. It lived in people's bones, inherited like blood. In the middle of that small town stood a weather-worn wooden church, St. Matthew's Holiness, its peeling white paint and leaning bell tower held together by nails, scripture, and stubbornness. The pastor there, Reverend Isaiah Cole, was not a large man, but the war had carved a different kind of weight into him. He'd worn the uniform of the United States Army in Europe, bled for a country that still called him boy, and returned home to find the same old rope hanging from the same old tree. Yet there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, a knowledge of how fear looked from the other side of a rifle. On a humid August morning, as cicadas screamed from the trees and the dust of passing trucks hung low and lazy, the Klan nailed a sign to the church door. 3 letters, crude and careless in dripping red paint, KKK beneath it, in smaller, jagged script, last warning. The congregation gathered in silence, faces tight, children pulled close. No one touched the sign. No one had to. The message had already burrowed into every heart except one. Reverend Isaiah stood before it, jaw clenched, his Bible in one hand, the other hand balled into a fist he did not yet show the world. That was the morning he decided that fear would not stay where it had always lived. The sanctuary held its breath as the morning light crept through the stained glass windows in thin, trembling slices, casting fractured colors across the worn pine pews. Families filled every row, their Sunday clothes pressed but faded, their faces carrying the weight of unspoken dread. Mothers kept their children close, their hands resting on small shoulders as if shielding them from something that waited just beyond the church walls. The sign the Klan had nailed to the door still hung outside, its red letters seeping into the wood like a fresh wound. No one spoke of it aloud, yet its presence filled the room more fully than any choir hymn. Even the sound of the ceiling fan clicking overhead felt hesitant, turning slow circles as though afraid to disturb the fragile courage gathered there. Reverend Isaiah Cole moved toward the pulpit with a steadiness he did not fully feel, the boards beneath his feet creaking softly in the quiet. He could see the questions in their eyes, men who worked the fields until their hands split open, women who buried fear in their aprons, children who already knew to look for danger before dawn. They were not asking for miracles. They were asking for a reason not to run. Isaiah rested his Bible gently atop the pulpit, its leather cover worn smooth by years of sermons, whispered over the wounded and the weary. He looked up, meeting the gaze of his congregation, and for a moment the world outside, the nooses, the night riders, the burning crosses, felt suspended, waiting for him to speak. When his voice finally broke the silence, it rose with a trembling that settled into something stronger, deeper, shaped by the memory of battlefields and ocean away. Fear, he said, letting the word hang in the air, has lived too long in our houses, sat at our tables, slept beside our children. A murmur rippled through the room, soft as wind through tall grass. Isaiah's hands tightened on the edges of the pulpit, knuckles whitening. But fear is not a master, he continued. It is a visitor, and visitors can be sent away. His voice grew steadier, resonant, filling every corner of the small wooden church. They want us trembling, they want us silent, they want us small. But I tell you today, the Lord did not shape us from dust, just to watch us bow to men dressed as ghosts. A hush fell over the room, not of fright, but of something awakening, something ancient, something ready. The words still hung in the air when a distant sound rolled through the open windows, the low, gravelly rumble of an engine approaching from the road that cut past the cotton fields. Conversations faltered, heads turned, even the babies grew quiet, as if the very air had shifted inside the church. Isaiah felt it before he heard it fully, that familiar vibration, that sickening recognition. He had heard heard the same sound in France before shells fell? The preface to danger, the breath before destruction. Outside, the engine slowed, its growl stretching into a long, menacing idle. The congregation stiffened as though bracing for impact, each heartbeat sinking to the mechanical drumming from outside. The sanctuary, once warm with faith, now pulsed with a cold thread of dread weaving through its walls. A young boy seated near the aisle, Samuel Reed, hardly 10, leaned toward the window, eyes wide as a saucer. His mother pulled him back sharply, but not before he whispered the word no one wanted to speak. Them. The sound of boots thudding onto packed red clay followed, deliberate and unhurried. Then came the unmistakable creak of the church's front steps under unfamiliar weight. Isaiah closed his Bible gently, feeling the tremor in his fingertips. His mind raced through every name of every man in town who might wear a hood by night and shake his hand by day. Lila's breath caught somewhere among the pews, though he couldn't see her through the crowd. The congregation seemed to draw inward as one body, shoulders rising, spines straightening, preparing for whatever crossed that threshold. The doorknob rattled once, a short, sharp, metallic twist. Then again, slower this time, as if testing the resolve of those inside. A murmur swept through the pews, a mingling of prayers and fear swallowed down too fast. Isaiah stepped from behind the pulpit, moving toward the center aisle with the calm gravity of a man walking into a storm he had already survived once in another land. As he approached the door, he raised a hand to still the trembling whispers, his voice low but unshaken. "This house," he said, "belongs to God, not cowards." The words barely left his lips when a fist pounded the door. One blow, heavy enough to rattle the hinges and send a shudder down the spine of every soul inside. Children cried out, mothers clutched them tight, and for the first time, Isaiah felt the moment shift, not towards surrender, but towards something rising quietly within the pews, something the Klan had never expected to face, a congregation that had tasted fear for the last time. The pounding came again, harder this time, the wood groaning beneath the force as dust drifted from the ceiling in soft, trembling clouds. Isaiah felt the tremor pass through the floorboards and into his feet, but he did not move. Behind him, the congregation shifted like a single organism, a sea of breath held tight, of eyes caught between terror and expectation. Men who had spent their lives bending their backs in the fields now straightened, jaws tightening. Women pulled their children into their laps, shielding them with arms taught by decades of endurance. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of old varnish and rising sweat, as if the church itself were bracing for whatever would breach its sanctuary. The third blow landed with a crack that sent a gasp rippling through the pews. Even the stained glass windows seemed to tremble in their frames. Isaiah stepped closer to the door, his breath calm but deep, the way it had been in the trenches when the first shell landed too close. His hand hovered just above the brass knob, feeling the cold metal radiating the presence of those on the other side. He could hear them now, low voices, jeering murmurs drifting through the thin wood, the unmistakable click of a rifle being handled carelessly, confidently. He felt every eye in the sanctuary on him, waiting to see whether their fear would choose to kneel or to stand. In that suspended moment, the weight of his father's teachings, his mother's prayers, his grandfather's scars carved by the lash, and the war that had reshaped him pressed into his spine. If we open this door in fear, Isaiah thought, we invite them into our souls. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back, refusing the instinct to confront violence on its own terms. The silence inside shattered when a voice from outside barked a command, swollen with hate, swollen with certainty. "Open up, preacher! We know you're in there hiding behind women and scripture!" A wave of murmurs swept through the pews, indignation rising like heat. Isaiah turned toward his congregation, and what he saw struck him with a fierce, unexpected reverence. They were afraid, profoundly so, yet something else burned beneath it, a flicker of defiance, a shared understanding that the Klan had come expecting prey, not people who still remembered the taste of dignity. With a single raised hand, he called them to stillness. "No one moves," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying too. "The furthest corner. Fear knocks loud, but it cannot cross a threshold held by faith." The pounding at the door ceased abruptly. replaced by a tense, breathless quiet. Even the cicadas outside fell silent. On both sides of the thin wooden barrier, two worlds waited, one trembling, the other starting to rise. The stillness sharpened into something brittle, the kind of silence that comes just before a storm decides where to break. A single bootstep sounded on the porch outside, slow and deliberate, followed by another, then another, each one pressing its weight into the church's front steps with the arrogance of men who had never been told no. The boards creaked beneath them, the sound sliding under the door like a cold breath. Inside, a woman in the third pew clutched her hymn book so tightly the corners bent beneath her fingers. Beside her, an elderly deacon closed his eyes, mouthing a scripture older than any hatred outside that door. Isaiah could feel the fear. In the room, trembling on the edge of becoming something else, something sharper, something with its own pulse. He placed his hand on the pulpit once more, grounding himself, grounding them all, drawing strength from the wood, polished by generations who had worshipped there long before the night riders learned their names. A sudden, metallic scrape jolted the room, the unmistakable sound of a shotgun barrel brushing against the doorframe. A few people stifled cries. A child whimpered, his mother pressing his head into her chest to shield him from the terror she couldn't stop. Isaiah turned his gaze upward, the rafters above him stretching like the ribs of a great wooden ship lost in a storm. "Not here," he whispered under his breath, though whether he spoke to God or to the men outside, he couldn't tell. The faint echo of coarse laughter drifted in, muffled but unmistakable, followed by a sharp tapping against the glass pane beside the door, the butt of a rifle. Knocking in a mockery of politeness, the congregation recoiled, but no one fled. Not this time. Something had settled into their bones, a shared understanding that turning their backs would only feed the hunger waiting outside. Then came the words, raw, taunting, as poisonous as the smoke from a burning cross. "You think that pulpit makes you brave, preacher?" a man called, his voice thick with amusement. "We can drag you out same as any other." A ripple passed through the pews, not of terror but of indignation, a slow, rising heat that felt almost holy. Isaiah felt it too, swelling behind him like a tide, called by an unseen moon. He stepped away from the pulpit and walked toward the front of the sanctuary, his boots thudding lightly on the wooden floor. With each step the congregation straightened, as though his movement pulled their spines upward, reminding them they had come from people who had survived chains, whips, and fields meant to break them. When Isaiah reached the center aisle, he stopped, turning his face toward the door, where the shadows of the men outside shifted like restless phantoms. "If you want me," he said, his voice calm, steady, powerful, "you'll have to come through every soul in this room, and I promise you, we do not scatter." The words had barely settled into the air when a sharp crack split the quiet. Not a gunshot, but the swift, angry snap of a boot kicking the lower panel of the church door. The wood splintered inward, shards scattering across the threshold like teeth knocked loose. Gasps erupted from the pews, but no one screamed. The fear that once ruled them now stood frozen, waiting to transform into something fiercer. Dust drifted through the air in trembling spirals where the impact had shaken the frame. Isaiah did not flinch. His gaze stayed fixed on the door as another blow followed, this one higher, sending a crack crawling upward like a lightning branch across the grain. Behind him, the congregation rose slowly, row by row, as if the floor itself were lifting them toward their feet. The air hummed with a strange, quiet power. Fragile, yes, but undeniable. Then, through the jagged hole near the bottom of the door, a gloved hand pushed through, groping blindly for the lock. Women pulled children against their skirts. Men stepped into the aisles, shoulders squared, jaws set. Old Mr. Carter, whose back had been bent by decades in the fields, straightened, with surprising steadiness, gripping the end of his cane like a staff. A chorus of small prayers whispered through the room, not pleas for safety, but prayers for courage, for witness, for deliverance. Isaiah felt the heat of their unity behind him, warm as a rising flame. He took a single step forward, positioning himself directly between the grasping hand and the congregation, his shadow stretching long across the sanctuary floor like a shield. "This is holy ground," he murmured, his voice low enough for those inside to hear, but not those outside. "And holy ground does not bow." The hand withdrew suddenly, not out of retreat, but to make room for a face. A man leaned close to the broken panel, his eyes peering in through the narrow sliver of destruction, pale, cold, certain, the kind of certainty born from never having been challenged. He grinned when he saw Isaiah standing firm, as if he were savoring the moment before the strike. "Didn't think we'd come in." "Daylight, did you?" he taunted, his voice a harsh whisper. "Thought you'd preach your pretty words while we waited in the dark?" Isaiah stepped closer until only the fractured wood lay between them. "Daylight shows truth," he said softly, "and truth don't fear shadows or sheets." For the first time, the man's grin faltered, not broken, but cracked, like a mirror catching its first fracture. Behind him, more voices stirred, uncertain. The tables, in some small but perceptible way, had begun to turn. A low murmur stirred among the men outside, their shadows shifting like restless spectres across the porch. Someone spat, another muttered a curse, and the sound of a shotgun being pumped sliced through the tension like a blade through cloth. The congregation stiffened as one, but no one fled. Instead, the air inside the sanctuary thickened, the heat rising not from fear alone, but from a gathering resolve that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the wooden rafters. Isaiah felt it, the shift, subtle yet seismic, a community that had spent generations bracing for blows, now standing upright, refusing to yield. The men outside expected trembling. Instead, they found a stillness too resolute to read, too steady to dismiss. That uncertainty pressed into them, making their confidence waver as surely as the humidity pressed into their starched collars. Bootsteps thudded across the porch again, this time quicker, angrier, the rhythm of men trying to convince themselves they still held the upper hand. "Bring the rope," one of them barked, his voice carrying through the broken panel with raw impatience. But another voice, lower, sharper, answered with unexpected hesitation. "Hold on. Something ain't right in there." The men muttered among themselves, their bravado bending beneath the weight of doubt. The congregation heard it too, each whispered word like a crack in the armor of certainty the Klan always wore. Isaiah let the silence stretch. Let the men outside wonder at a world they thought they understood. Sometimes strength was not in shouting, sometimes it was in refusing to be moved. He stood with his hands at his sides, palms open, as if offering them the chance to walk away before the tide rose against them. When no retreat came, Isaiah's voice broke the silence. Not loud but clear, rolling through the sanctuary like a steady drumbeat. "You came here to break something," he said, speaking through the shattered panel. "But you chose the wrong building." A hush fell over both sides of the door. "This house was built on the prayers of people who survived worse men than you," he continued. "And if you think broken wood will make us bow, then you don't know the strength of the ground you're standing on." For a moment the world held its breath. Even the cicadas outside stilled. Isaiah felt every soul behind him rise like a tide, silent, unyielding. The men on the porch shifted, boots scuffing the wood, their certainty slipping like sweat down their backs. It was the first time in their lives they had knocked on a door and found themselves on the weaker side of it. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a taut, electric stillness, the kind that wraps itself around the spine and waits. Outside, the men shifted again, their bravado dissolving into restless uncertainty. A few steps retreated toward the porch rail, boards creaking under their weight. Others lingered near the door, but even their shadows seemed less sure of themselves now. Isaiah could hear the faint rustle of cloth, the uneasy clearing of throats, the way hatred shakes when it suddenly finds itself without the upper hand. Inside the sanctuary, something deeper unfurled, a collective breath released not from relief, but from recognition. For the first time in memory, the fear was not all theirs. It had begun to seep under the hoods, into the hands gripping ropes and rifles. Fear had started to change sides, slowly but unmistakably. Isaiah stepped closer to the broken doorframe, not out of recklessness, but out of conviction, his posture calm, as if he were addressing a troubled soul rather than a mob. The congregation watched, their whispers fading into a reverent hush. Sunlight spilled through the splintered wood, cutting his silhouette into sharp relief and drawing a thin, bright line across the sanctuary floor. The men outside flinched when he leaned close enough for them to see his eyes, not frantic, not pleading, but resolute with a strength that no weapon could command. "What you're doing here," he said softly, "ain't courage. Courage faces a man in daylight without a mask. Courage don't need numbers or fire to feel tall." His words slid into the cracks of their confidence like cold water, making them shiver beneath their robes. Somewhere near the back of the group, someone muttered, "We ought to go." But the tallest of the men, the one whose voice had barked the earlier orders, stepped forward, his shadow dominating the fractured panel. "You think a few pretty verses make you a king?" he snarled. His anger masked something more fragile, the unfamiliar sting of being challenged on ground he believed he owned. Isaiah did not raise his voice. "No," he answered, "but truth don't need a throne. It stands by itself." A murmur rippled through the congregation, low and strong, like thunder rolling beneath. "The earth!" The leader hesitated, and the hesitation spread, contagious and corrosive. Men who had once felt powerful in their robes now shifted uneasily beneath the weight of being seen, truly seen, by people who refused to cower. The balance tilted further, quiet but undeniable. When the leader finally spoke again, his voice no longer boomed. It wavered, just enough for everyone, inside and out, to hear. The leader's wavering breath scraped against the wood like a dull blade, audible even through the broken panel. His shadow loomed large, but its edges trembled, betraying the faltering certainty beneath the hood. For a moment he said nothing, the silence dragging long and ragged between them. The men behind him shuffled in the dust, glancing toward the road, as though calculating escape routes they had never needed before. Inside, the congregation sensed the shift, a subtle but seismic rearranging of power, and the air grew warmer, fuller, alive, with something rising in their chests. Isaiah stepped forward into the shaft of sunlight spilling through the ruin in the door, and the glow caught the sweat on his brow, making him appear both exhausted and unbreakable. He held the leader's shadow in his gaze, the way one might hold a snake, not with fear, but with understanding. The leader finally spat a curse, though the force behind it had thinned. "You think you're untouchable, preacher," he barked, but the words came brittle, as if he were testing them rather than wielding them. "You think standing in that pulpit makes you something more than the rest of your kind." His words sought the old wound, the one they had relied upon for generations, shame as a weapon. But when he looked through the broken opening again, expecting the familiar flinch, he found none. Isaiah's face held no anger, no trembling, only a steady, grounded dignity that made the leader recoil ever so slightly, as though he'd stepped too close to a fire he didn't understand. Inside the sanctuary, someone whispered, "Stand, Reverend," and the whisper rippled quietly through the pews, strengthening him like a hand at his back. Isaiah's reply came not as a shout, but as a measured truth. "Untouchable. No, I'm a man, flesh and bone like you, but the difference between us is simple. I know what I fear and I face it. You hide yours behind a hood." The congregation murmured again, low and deep, a sound like earth shifting. The leader stiffened, his pride wounded in the place where arrogance lives. He opened his mouth to retort, but one of his own men grabbed his sleeve. "Enough, Earl!" the younger man hissed, his voice sharp with unease. "This ain't going like it's supposed to." The leader jerked his arm free, but Isaiah saw it then, the fracture spreading through the mob, trust decaying, authority evaporating. Fear, once their weapon, now curled around their ankles like smoke, drawing them backward. For the first Time. Those outside the door began to look over their shoulders instead of through the wood, as if suddenly aware that daylight had been watching everything. A tense hush settled over the porch, thick as humidity before a summer storm. The leader's breath rasped behind the thin veil of his hood, his confidence thinning with every heartbeat. One of the younger men, barely more than a boy, shifted nervously, his boots scraping the porch boards in small, uncertain arcs. His hands trembled around the rope he carried, its loop dragging uselessly in the dust. "Earl, we need to go," he muttered again, louder this time, the words wobbling as though he feared them almost as much as staying. Another man backed toward the steps, glancing down the road where the heat shimmered. This time, their retreat was not subtle. It was visible, contagious, a faltering that spread like a crack through glass. Inside the sanctuary, the congregation watched with wide, breathless eyes, witnessing for the first time in their lives the sight of the Klan stepping back. Not advancing, not seizing, stepping back. Earl's pride flared in a desperate attempt to reclaim ground slipping beneath him. "You think this means you won something?" He spat through the splintered wood, but the venom in his voice wavered, diluted by fear creeping under his skin. He slammed a fist against the damaged panel again, but even that blow landed unevenly, lacking the force of moments before. "We'll be back," he growled. "Tonight, tomorrow, whenever we please." But no sooner had the threat left his lips than one of his own men answered, "No, Earl, you go back if you want. I ain't staying here to get shot for your pride." The words hit harder than any weapon. Earl twisted toward him, stunned, as if the betrayal were more unthinkable than the congregation's defiance. Another man followed, stepping away, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. "They ain't scared of us." "Earl, not today." Inside, the temperature shifted subtly, powerfully, from terror to a rising warmth that felt like breath returning to lungs long denied. Isaiah felt the force of that transformation behind him, a silent wave of strength that anchored his stance. He leaned closer to the fractured door, his voice steady, carrying not triumph but conviction. "This is the last time you knock on this house believing we are yours to break," he said. "Fear has lived in our walls long. Enough. Today, it found a new home." His words struck the men outside with the weight of a bell tolling. Earl recoiled, glancing from shadow to sunlight, suddenly exposed, a tyrant shriveling in the very daylight he believed he commanded. The porch, once a stage for terror, now became a place of unraveling. As Earl hesitated, one foot half-turned toward flight, the congregation exhaled in unison, not in relief, but in recognition. This was the moment fear crossed the threshold and chose a new side. Earl stood frozen on the porch, caught between command and collapse, his breath turning shallow beneath the hood that once made him feel untouchable. The other men had already stepped back, their boots kicking up dry red dust as they retreated, no longer a unified force, but a scattering of exposed nerves. The rope one of them carried slipped from his hand and lay coiled on the wooden planks like a dead thing, robbed of purpose. Inside the sanctuary, the congregation did not move or celebrate. They watched, still and solemn, witnessing what their parents and grandparents had never lived to see, the spectacle of hatred shrinking before unarmed, unbowed people. Even the cicadas resumed their droning in the trees, as if claiming the silence that the mob had dared to interrupt. Isaiah felt the weight of history in that breathless moment, the heavy echo of those who had stood without protection for so long. Earl finally broke the stillness with a sharp inhale, as though dragging air into lungs that had learned too late what fear tasted like. "This ain't over," he muttered, but his voice lacked the iron edge it once carried. The threat landed weakly, dissipating into the humid air like steam from a cooling kettle. He stepped backward, the porch groaning beneath his boots, his shadow shrinking across the fractured doorframe. For the first time, the hood seemed to sag on his shoulders, not as an emblem of terror, but as a shroud of shame. He glanced at the men who had once followed him without question, and found no loyalty left in their stance, only hesitation, discomfort, and a dawning realization that they had crossed a threshold not meant for them. The daylight revealed everything their hoods were meant to hide: cowardice, division, doubt. Inside, Isaiah lowered his hands slowly, not in victory but in reverence. He turned to face his people, and what he saw struck him with almost mourning tenderness. Men, standing taller than when the morning began. Women with tears shining not from terror, but from release. Children watching with wide, unblinking eyes as the world shifted its weight before them. No one spoke. Words would have cheapened what the moment had carved into them. Instead, they remained in quiet formation, a congregation transformed into a wall of unbreakable witness. Outside, Earl made one last faltering glance toward the door, as though hoping someone inside would flinch, break, or plead. But no movement came, only the unwavering stillness of a people no longer kneeling. He turned at last, defeated not by weapons, but by a truth more powerful than fire. Fear was leaving them, and it was claiming him instead. The men descended the church steps in a disordered cluster, their hoods tilting, their shoulders hunched, as though the very sunlight had turned against them. Earl trailed behind, his boots dragging furrows in the red clay, each step a reluctant admission of defeat. Their truck waited on the road like a dying beast, its engines sputtering in the heavy Alabama heat. When the men climbed into the back, they no longer carried themselves with the swagger of night riders. They looked like farmhands caught stealing from their own barn. One of them glanced over his shoulder at the church, expecting a bullet or a curse, but none came. Only the steady gaze of a people who had decided, at long last, that their fear was no longer for sale. The engine growled weakly, struggling to start, as if reluctant to carry its passengers away from the reckoning they had met. Inside the sanctuary, Isaiah let out a long, trembling breath. The adrenaline drained from his muscles, leaving behind a bone-deep ache that felt almost holy. He stepped back from the door and turned to face his congregation. The sight undid him. Men who had endured decades of bowed heads now stood with tears slipping silently down their cheeks. Mothers hugged their children, not in terror, but in gratitude, a gratitude shaped by survival, by witnessing the unthinkable. Old Mrs. Carter pressed a hand to her heart, whispering a prayer that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. No one moved to leave. They lingered in the moment, letting it settle into their bones, letting it become something they could carry with them into every dark corner of their lives. A murmur of soft hymns drifted upward from somewhere in the back pews, voices joining slowly until the whole room seemed to hum with a trembling, victorious reverence. Isaiah walked down the center aisle, each step heavy with the knowledge of what had just taken place. Not a battle, not a riot, but a shifting of the earth beneath their feet. When he reached the front row, he took Lila's hand, feeling her grip steady and warm despite the tremor that still lived in her bones. He looked into the faces of his people, and they looked back with a reverence he had never sought, but suddenly understood. This was not about him. It was about all of them, their endurance, their lineage, their refusal to vanish. He raised his voice gently, so softly that the cicadas outside nearly swallowed the sound. "Go home," he told them. "Walk proud. Today something broke, but it was not us." The congregation stepped into the sunlight in quiet procession, each person shining with a dignity the world had tried for centuries to smother. And as the truck, carrying the broken mob, disappeared down the distant road, one truth settled over Condor County like a benediction. The day fear changed sides would be remembered long after the footprints faded from the dusty church steps.